I was only a kid when the whispers began. Small towns like ours didn't have much else to do besides watch each other's lives unfold. Every street had its quiet mysteries, but none were as captivating as the Collins house. It wasn't just that their place stood out, a new, pristine structure on a block lined with aging homes. It was the way Mr. Collins carried himself, the way his life seemed to orbit around his gleaming black sports car like it was some dark star pulling everything else in. I remember watching him through my bedroom window. While the other neighbors chatted over fences or mowed their overgrown lawns, Mr. Collins was always out there, cloth in hand, polishing every inch of that car. Hours would pass, the sun dipping behind the trees, and still, he'd be there. Methodical, meticulous. He never waved, never looked around, just focused on that car like it held the answer to some unspoken question. Mrs. Collins, on the other hand, was the picture of warmth. She'd wave at my mom when she walked our dog, stop to chat with me about school, even hand out her famous cookies during the holidays. Their daughter, Stacy, was barely 2. A little bundle of giggles and tiny rain boots that splashed in every puddle. They seemed so normal, so steady. But that feeling didn't last. One day, they were gone. Mrs. Collins, Stacy, just vanished. I remember the police coming to our door, their somber faces asking if we'd seen anything unusual. Mr. Collins told them his wife had packed up and left, taken Stacy with her. That was his story, but even as a kid, I could tell something was off. My mom whispered her doubts late at night when she thought I was asleep. My dad muttered under his breath about how people don't just disappear without a word. But the police found nothing. No note, no struggle, no clear reason for why a woman with a baby would just leave. The first few weeks after their disappearance were the worst. The neighbors talked in low tones by the mailboxes, theories bouncing back and forth. Some believed Mrs. Collins had run off with someone else. Others hinted at darker possibilities. And then there was Mr. Collins himself, unchanged, stoic. He still went outside every weekend and polished that car, as if nothing had happened. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was just a man dedicated to keeping his prized possession spotless. But I knew better. Everyone on our street did. Months passed, and the whispers turned into uneasy silence. The only thing louder than the rumors was the eerie quiet of the Collins house. Until that day, the day my dad saw something he couldn't explain. It was an afternoon like any other. My dad was in our garage, fiddling with his old truck, when he noticed the Collins garage door cracked open. He called me over and pointed inside. I saw it too. Mrs. Collins's white Jeep, untouched, layered with a thin coat of dust. If she'd left, if she'd truly run away, why would her car still be here? We didn't understand it then, but that small detail started a slow unraveling. Not long after, the Jeep disappeared, just gone. Mr. Collins sold it, I guess, or moved it somewhere we couldn't see. He never said a word about it, but he started changing after that. He spent less time outside. His once immaculate yard grew neglected, and the car he used to treasure so much began to gather dirt. It was like he was fading, withdrawing into himself. Whatever had been holding him together, whatever routine or obsession kept him going, was falling apart. Then came the night of the crash. My family was eating dinner when we heard it, a loud, metallic thud from the direction of the Collins house. My dad grabbed a flashlight and told my mom and me to stay inside. I remember peering through the curtains as he walked over, his silhouette crossing the front yard and disappearing into the dim light by Mr. Collins's door. When Mr. Collins answered, my dad told us later, he looked pale, almost sick. He brushed off the noise as a dropped toolbox, but my dad wasn't convinced. He said there was something in the house, a strange smell, a pot of some dark liquid bubbling on the stove, and, most unnerving of all, a gun on the counter. My dad came back to our house shaken, saying he didn't know what to make of it. He just knew something wasn't right. After that, Mr. Collins rarely came outside. The few times we saw him, he looked haggard, skittish. He never met anyone's eyes. The neighbors' whispers returned, more urgent now. Theories spiraled into accusations. People said he must have done something terrible, that he must have hurt his wife and daughter. But without evidence, it all stayed just that: rumors, fears, and the lingering suspicion that we'd never know the truth. Years passed. I grew up, moved away, tried to leave it all behind. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the memory of that house. I still see it in my mind sometimes, the way it looked before everything fell apart. I remember Mrs. Collins's kind smile, Stacy's laughter echoing through the yard, and the way Mr. Collins polished his car like it was the only thing that mattered. Every once in a while, late at night, I think about them, about what might have happened, about the secrets buried in that house. I'll never know the truth, but I can't help wondering. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I still feel that chill, as if the past is reaching out, reminding me that some mysteries never fade. I had been delivering food for several months, crisscrossing the city every night. Most shifts were uneventful, just following the GPS, dropping off meals, and moving on. But this night was different. It started with an order that came through well past midnight, leading me into a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The GPS guided me away from the familiar streets, twisting and turning through a maze of narrow roads that didn't seem to match the map. Streetlights grew sparse, and shadows from the tall trees stretched long and distorted across the pavement. The further I drove, the more unsettled I felt, like the air itself had thickened with something unseen. Eventually, the GPS chimed. "You've arrived at your destination." The house at the end of the cul-de-sac stood in stark contrast to the rest. Its paint peeled in long strips, its windows gaped like empty eyes, and weeds overran the yard. It looked abandoned. I hesitated, hand hovering over the gear shift, ready to leave. But I thought about the job, about the customer waiting for their food. Maybe someone still lived there. Maybe it was just a rundown house that no one had bothered to fix up. I grabbed the bag of food, stepped out of the car, and started up the gravel path. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, as I approached the porch. My footsteps crunched loudly in the eerie silence, each one echoing in the stillness. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking open with the barest nudge. A dark hallway yawned before me, the light from the porch barely reaching past the threshold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding far more uncertain than I intended. There was no reply, only the faint echo of my own words bouncing back. A chill prickled up my neck. I told myself to just leave the food and go. But something, a mix of curiosity and obligation, made me take a step inside. The air seemed even heavier now, thick with a feeling I couldn't explain. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, faint but distinct, like leaves being dragged across the floor. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to run. I turned back toward the street, and that's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, stepping out from the shadows between houses. They moved slowly, silently, gliding over the ground like ghosts. My heart thundered in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. They got closer, and the dim porch light caught their faces, or rather, their masks. Blank, featureless white masks that gave no clue to who or what was beneath them. They surrounded me before I could react. The porch railing pressed against my back, trapping me. One of them reached out. The mask tilted slightly, as if studying me, and then a hand gripped my arm, ice cold and unnaturally strong. I dropped the food bag. Their grip tightened, pulling me toward the house. I fought, but their strength was overwhelming. The door swung closed behind us, plunging me into absolute darkness. In the pitch-black hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoed faintly around me. I could hear them breathing, feel their hands searching my pockets. They took my wallet, my phone, my keys. I wanted to scream, to struggle more, but it was as if the darkness itself muffled my voice and sapped my strength. My thoughts spiraled into chaos. Who were these people? What did they want? And why hadn't I just driven away the moment I saw that house? Finally, they released me. I crumpled to the floor, trembling. I could hear them moving away, their footsteps growing softer, the door creaking open and then closing again. Silence followed, thick, heavy, and suffocating. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. My mind played the events over and over, each replay leaving me more confused, more terrified. When I finally forced myself to stand, my legs shook beneath me. I stumbled toward the door, fumbled it open, and stepped out into the night. The street was empty. The figures were gone. My car still sat where I'd left it, untouched, as if none of it had happened. But something had happened. Something I couldn't explain. I drove away as fast as I could, the winding road still disorienting me, twisting and turning until I finally reached a main road. I didn't look back. I just drove, trying to put distance between myself and that house, between me and the masked figures. But I knew that no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape what I'd experienced. It wasn't just the loss of my wallet or phone that haunted me. It was the feeling of being stripped of something far more intangible. My sense of safety, my trust in the familiar. Every time I close my eyes, I see those blank masks, those cold hands pulling me into darkness. The memory lingers, like a shadow I can never quite outrun. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't made it back to the car? What if they're still out there, waiting in the shadows for their next delivery? The night shift at the hospital always felt endless, a slow march through a never-changing backdrop of white walls, muted fluorescent lights, and the steady, monotonous beeping of machines. As an orderly, I was used to the eerie silence that settled over the halls after dark, the kind of quiet that made every creak and whisper seem louder, more significant. My small sanctuary during those long hours was a dimly lit basement office, a place where I could sit, sip coffee, and wait out the night. That office, however, was unsettlingly close to the morgue. The knowledge of what lay just beyond a nearby door never fully left my mind. I told myself I'd grown accustomed to it, that it was just another part of the hospital's labyrinth. But deep down, I never really shook the unease. It was a little after midnight when something changed. I was sitting in the office with another orderly, killing time with idle conversation. The air carried its usual sterile tang of disinfectant, the faint buzz of the overhead light blending with the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. We were halfway through a half-hearted debate about a local sports team when we both froze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed down the hallway. They weren't hurried, the kind of steps you'd expect from a doctor rushing to a patient, nor the brisk click of a nurse making rounds. No, these steps were deliberate, unhurried, and unnervingly even. We turned to the open doorway, our eyes locking on a man passing by. He glanced at us, just a brief flicker of recognition, and then continued walking. There was something about him, something subtle but off. He was pale, his eyes hollowed, and he moved like he didn't quite belong. We exchanged a glance, shrugged it off, and returned to our conversation. Strange things happened at night. Maybe he was just another funeral home worker, or perhaps a lost visitor. But then he came back. This time, he stopped in the doorway. He stared at us, his face slack but his eyes wide, darting between us like he was searching for something. His clothes were neat, but oddly outdated, almost like he'd stepped out of another decade. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he looked at us. It was unsettling, a gaze that felt both desperate and calculating. "Do you have access to the morgue?" he asked, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't spoken aloud in years. His words hung in the air, heavy and cold. My colleague and I exchanged uneasy looks. We both knew funeral home staff sometimes came to pick up bodies at odd hours. This wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. And yet, something about the way he asked the question, the timing, the tone, none of it felt right. "Yes," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What do you need?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "I'll pay you to let me in, just for an hour. I need to be alone with the bodies." The words hit me like a slap. The other orderly stiffened, his face going pale. My stomach churned as I tried to process what I'd just heard. Why would anyone need that? Why would anyone even ask? "We can't do that," I said quickly, my voice firmer this time. "It's against hospital policy." His face darkened. He didn't shout or argue. He didn't even raise his voice. But there was a tightening in his jaw, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that made my skin crawl. He didn't try to convince us, didn't plead his case. He just stood there, staring at us, until finally, he turned and walked away. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room broke, and I realized my hands were shaking. "What was that?" the other orderly whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely steady, "but we need to tell security." The walk to the security office felt endless. Every shadow seemed darker, every corner hiding unseen dangers. When we got there, we quickly explained what had happened, our words tumbling over each other as we recounted the man's pale face, his strange request, his unsettling demeanor. The security guard's expression changed as we spoke. He leaned forward, his voice tense. "Did he say he wanted to be alone with the bodies?" the guard asked. "Yes," I replied, a chill running down my spine. The guard let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "We've dealt with him before. He's shown up a few times, always at night, always trying to get into the morgue. Every time we try to catch him, he's gone before we can do anything. But he keeps coming back." A cold dread settled in my chest. This wasn't a one-time incident. This man had been here before, more than once, and each time he'd asked for the same thing. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't harmless. "What does he want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The guard didn't answer. He just shook his head again, muttering something about increasing patrols. We left the security office no more reassured than when we arrived. Back in the basement, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the faint sound of distant machines hummed in the background. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still there, somewhere close, watching from the shadows. For the rest of the shift, I stayed on edge, every sound making my heart race. The quiet hum of the hospital had never felt so threatening. Even after my shift ended, as I stepped into the crisp morning air, the memory of that man lingered. His pale face, his quiet desperation, and his haunting request played over and over in my mind. I never saw him again after that night, but the experience stayed with me, a reminder that not all shadows in the hospital were harmless. Some hid secrets too dark to imagine, and some, I feared, would never fully stay away. 2019, when I was 13, my dad took me hunting in the Pine Barrens. We'd been there before, but this time something felt off. The forest seemed darker, the trees more crowded, as if they were leaning in to trap us. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles. It was so quiet that even the wind barely stirred, and for the first time, I felt unease creeping in with the fading light. We arrived just before sunset and set up near the forest's edge. My dad always said the best hunting happened after dark, when animals became more active. I'd been out with him before and always trusted his steady presence. But as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the forest began to feel like a living thing, the shadows stretching and shifting, turning the familiar trails into a dark maze. Still, I held onto the small rifle he'd given me for my birthday, its cool metal steady in my hands, and followed him deeper into the woods. As we moved further in, the trees seemed to press closer together, shutting out the moonlight. Soon, the only light we had came from our flashlights. My dad would occasionally stop to inspect the ground, his tracking skills usually sharp, but tonight the forest was eerily still. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs, nothing. It was as if everything had gone into hiding. After an hour of walking, my legs began to ache, and I wanted to rest. My dad noticed and suggested we take a break. We found a small clearing and sat down on a fallen log. The stillness around us was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast, as if my body sensed something my mind hadn't fully grasped yet. My dad whispered something about patience, about waiting for the right moment, but I barely heard him. My attention was fixed on the impenetrable darkness all around us. That's when I heard it, a low, deep growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the growl of a small animal. It was something larger, something that sent a chill racing down my spine. I turned to look at my dad. His face had gone pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Slowly, he reached for his rifle and motioned for me to do the same. The growl came again, closer this time. It seemed to echo through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tightened my grip on my rifle, my hands shaking. My dad stood up, scanning the woods, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't say a word, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever was out there, it was something he hadn't encountered before. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. A hulking figure, taller than any animal I'd ever seen, stepped into view. Its body was hunched, its eyes faintly glowing in the dark. It looked like a wolf, but it was impossibly large, its presence otherworldly. The growling intensified, more aggressive now. In the faint light of our flashlights, I could see its sharp teeth, its breath misting in the cold night air. My dad whispered for me to stay still, and though my legs felt like jelly, I didn't move. I stood frozen, my gaze locked on the creature as it edged closer. Its eyes glowed yellow, predatory and unblinking, fixed on us. My dad raised his rifle, aiming steadily, but he didn't fire. It was as if we both understood that shooting wouldn't help, that it might even make things worse. The creature began to circle us, slipping in and out of the shadows. Each time it disappeared, it would reappear somewhere else, closer than before. The growl turned into a snarl that rattled my nerves. The forest, so silent before, now felt alive with tension. I couldn't breathe, my chest tight with fear, as the creature continued to stalk us. Then it let out a bone-chilling howl. The sound was so loud, so guttural, it seemed to shake the trees. That's when my dad grabbed my arm and whispered, "Run?" Without thinking, I bolted. The underbrush scratched at my arms and legs as I sprinted, the sound of the creature's growls echoing behind me. My dad was right on my heels, urging me to keep going. We didn't care where we were running, only that we needed to get away. The forest became a blur. The trails we thought we knew were gone, replaced by an endless tangle of trees and darkness. My lungs burned. My legs screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. The thought of that thing catching up to us drove me forward. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, the growling had ceased, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. My dad leaned against a tree, pale and trembling, and whispered, "We have to keep moving." I nodded, but I didn't know which way to go. We were lost, the familiar landmarks swallowed by the dark. After what felt like hours of wandering, we stumbled upon a narrow, overgrown path that I recognized. Relief surged through me, and we followed it back to the truck. When we reached it, I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands still shaking. My dad started the engine without a word, and we drove away, the forest and its horrors fading into the distance. Neither of us spoke on the way home. The encounter was something neither of us could explain, something we didn't want to think about. But as I stared out the window at the dark trees rushing past, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't been alone in those woods. We made it out unharmed, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never set foot in the Pine Barrens again. My life as a gas station clerk wasn't glamorous, but it was predictable. I'd been working the night shift for about a year, and the routine was always the same. Sit behind the counter, count the hours, and ring up the occasional customer. The station was on the edge of town, far enough out that late-night traffic was rare. Most nights, the only sounds I heard were the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant buzz of the air conditioning. This particular night was no different, at least at first. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was counting down the minutes until the end of my shift. The station was dead quiet, the parking lot deserted, and my thoughts were focused on making sure the cash drawer was balanced. My manager always insisted on accuracy, especially at night. "You never know who might walk in," she'd say. I used to think she was just being paranoid. As I counted the last few bills, the calm was shattered. The front door slammed open so hard it shook the walls. My heart jumped. A man stormed in. He was scruffy and unkempt, his clothes dirty, his eyes wild. The smell hit me before anything else. Stale sweat and booze, like he hadn't seen a shower in days. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the cash in my hand. I froze. For a few seconds, time seemed to stretch, my thoughts grinding to a halt. Then he lunged. One moment the cash was in my hand, and the next it was gone. The guy was already halfway out the door before I could even react. Instinct took over. I didn't think, I just moved. I ran around the counter and bolted after him, shouting, "Hey, stop!" The adrenaline drowned out my fear. The guy was stumbling, unsteady on his feet. As he reached the parking lot, I noticed the cash sticking out of his pocket. He looked back at me, panic flashing across his face, and tried to run faster. But his body wasn't cooperating. He must have been on something. I was closing the gap. My feet pounded against the pavement, and I was so focused on catching up that I barely noticed the cold bite of the night air. "Stop right there," I yelled again. He turned, his eyes wide. For a second, it seemed like he was going to fight. But when I grabbed his arm, his struggle was weak, his movements sluggish. I held on, pulling him back toward the station. He twisted free, stumbling, but he didn't get far. That's when I realized I needed to call for help. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I told the dispatcher what had happened. They promised officers were on their way. I kept my distance from the man, following him as he staggered down the street. I didn't want to get too close. Who knew what he might do? But I couldn't let him disappear into the dark. The minutes dragged. My heart raced as I trailed him, my breath coming in short gasps. Every time he looked over his shoulder, I ducked back, staying just far enough that he wouldn't see me as a threat. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes before I heard the distant sound of sirens. He heard them too. He stopped, his shoulders tensing. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. I stayed where I was, letting the police take over. Their cars pulled into the lot, red and blue lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, their voices sharp and commanding. "Get on the ground," they shouted. The man hesitated, but he knew it was over. He sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he placed them behind his head. They cuffed him and pulled him to his feet. One officer turned to me, asking for the full story. I tried to keep my voice steady, recounting the events as best as I could. My hands were still shaking, and I could feel the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving me exhausted. The officers checked the man's jacket and found the cash, crumpled and stuffed into his pocket. They told me he was likely homeless and on drugs. His erratic behavior suddenly made sense. I watched as they led him to the back of a squad car. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped. In that moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. This was someone who had made a desperate, terrible choice, someone who probably had nowhere else to turn. One of the officers thanked me, telling me I'd done the right thing by calling them. Chasing him wasn't the safest move, they added, but it worked out. I nodded, still trying to process everything. As they drove off, the station felt different. It wasn't the quiet, safe haven it had been before. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the shadows darker. I sat behind the counter for the rest of my shift, staring at the door, half expecting someone else to burst in. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the night's events. When my shift finally ended, I locked up and walked to my car. As I turned the key and drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. What had brought him to this point? Could his life have turned out differently? That night, I realized just how fragile the line is between the routine and the unexpected. I made it home, safe and sound, but I knew I'd carry the memory of that night for a long time. The road unfurled before us, a narrow ribbon of black surrounded by an endless expanse of forest. It was supposed to be a weekend to unwind. Just me, Devin, Bethany, and Seth, taking a break from the grind of college. We had planned every detail down to the perfect camping spot, imagining nights under the stars, roasting marshmallows, and telling stories around a fire. But something about that night was off. The trees loomed closer than they should, their gnarled branches twisting like arthritic fingers. The moon barely cut through the thick canopy, and the shadows danced unnaturally on the pavement. I tried to shake it off, blaming my nerves on the excitement of the trip. We laughed along with the music, letting our favorite songs erase the weight of the semester, when suddenly, Devin cursed. A sharp turn appeared out of nowhere. Devin yanked the wheel, but the tires lost their grip on the wet asphalt. The car spun, the world tilting and swirling. My heart jumped into my throat as Bethany screamed, and then came the jarring crunch of metal. Everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, we were standing outside the car. It sat crumpled against a tree, the front end mangled and steaming. I felt disoriented, as though I was underwater. Bethany was pale, Seth was frozen in place, and Devin stood to the side, his face unreadable. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, my voice sounding distant and flat. Bethany nodded, but she wouldn't look at me. Seth just stared, unblinking. I followed his gaze back to the wreck and froze. There, inside the car, were us. My breath hitched as I stared at the impossible. My own body was slumped forward in the passenger seat, a streak of blood on my temple. Devin was still gripping the steering wheel, his face contorted in pain. Bethany and Seth, too, strapped in their seats, lifeless. Yet, here we stood outside the car. What is this?" I whispered, my words trembling as much as my hands. Bethany finally turned to me, her eyes wide and glassy. "We're out here," she murmured, her voice thin, "but we're still in there." My mind fought against the logic. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination. I reached out to touch the car, hoping for the solid reassurance of metal, but my hand passed through it. It felt like falling through ice-cold water. I jerked back, my chest tightening with panic. "Are we dead?" Seth's voice was barely audible. His question hung heavy in the air. None of us wanted to answer, to acknowledge the grim possibility. Yet no other explanation made sense. How could we be standing here while our bodies lay limp and lifeless inside the wreck? The forest seemed to close in, the trees dark and menacing. The air turned heavy, dense with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Every nerve in my body screamed that we were being watched. I spun around, trying to find the source of the unease, but there was nothing but darkness. The shadows were alive, whispering, creeping closer. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt like I was being pulled toward the wreck, like gravity itself was trying to drag me back. "We need to go," I stammered, my voice breaking. Maybe we can still fix this." "Fix what?" Bethany asked, her voice brittle. "Where can we even go?" She was right. We were miles from any town, surrounded by a wall of black forest. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The car, with our broken bodies inside, felt like the only anchor in a sea of dark confusion. Time became meaningless. I couldn't tell if we had been standing there for minutes or hours. The night stretched on endlessly, and every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made me flinch. It felt like the forest was breathing around us, suffocating us in its cold, indifferent grasp. Suddenly, I felt a pull, like a whirlpool sucking me under. My vision blurred, the world fading to black once more. I heard Bethany cry out, saw Seth's face twisting in fear, and then nothing. When I came to, I was lying in a hospital bed. The sterile light above me was blinding, the beeping of monitors sharp in my ears. I turned my head slowly, my body heavy and uncooperative. There was Devin, in the bed beside me, his eyes barely open. Bethany and Seth were there too, pale and bandaged, but breathing. I blinked, trying to piece it all together. We were alive. But how? The last thing I remembered was standing outside that wreck, staring at our own lifeless forms. "You're awake?" A nurse entered the room, her kind smile a jarring contrast to the terror I had felt. "You've been unconscious for a couple of days, but you're going to be okay." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe we had survived and that the nightmare was over. But as I looked at my friends, at the pale faces and wide eyes, I knew I wasn't alone in questioning it. Had we truly been outside that car? Or was it all some horrific dream born from the trauma of the crash? The memory of the forest, the cold weight of that reality, was still too vivid, too raw. It didn't feel like a dream. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I decided it didn't matter. We were alive, and that was enough. The rest, well, maybe I'd never know.